Hello, tonight we're going to talk about Darwin and Darwin's voyages and some of the discoveries he made while on his voyage. Darwin was a young man in England. He was not a firstborn son, and firstborn sons of the aristocracy received all the money and the title and things like that. He didn't receive that, and so he had a choice. He could go to school, he could go into the military, or become part of the church. Well, he chose to go to school and to study. At the end of his schooling, when he was about 19 years old, after finishing college, he was kind of at loose ends, and he didn't really know what to do. And a friend recommended that he join this boat, this ship called the HMS Beagle, and sail around the world and collect specimens on this trip. What this trip was for was it was a scientific expedition that was supposed to collect specimens from all over the world wherever they stopped. And so his job on this boat was to go ashore, collect plants and animals and fossils, and collect them and store them in the hold of the boat. And so he did that for 5 years. It was a very long trip. Eventually, he ended up at the Galapagos Islands, and this is a picture of the Galapagos Islands, and you can see kind of the red line is where his boat traveled around the Galapagos Islands. And we'll talk more about his voyage as we go through this lecture tonight. Before Darwin left on his voyage, there were several scientists who had developed several different ideas and had published them and were trying to make sense of the world. Basically, that's what they're trying to do, trying to make it make sense scientifically and religiously and everything like that. And so he had some background information to draw from. One of the first early scientists, his name was Carolus Linnaeus. What he did, he lived, I think, in France or something, and what he did was he went through all of the different specimens that had ever been collected, and he created a binomial system of taxonomy to classify them. We still use his taxonomy today. Do you remember the thing? It goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Linnaeus is the scientist who did that, and he tried to figure out what animals were related to what other ones. At fossils, he tried to look at plants, fungus, everything. And he tried to put it all into the system so everybody would know who's related to whom. That was Linnaeus. Well, a lot of the things that he discovered was that, a lot of organisms really are very, very, very similar. Another scientist, Charles Cuvier, proposed basically that catastrophes happen and that animals go extinct. No one had ever thought about that before, because in the religious texts, God created the heavens and the earth, and everything that has ever been alive has always been alive, and nothing has gone extinct. And all of a sudden, Cuvier is looking at the fossil record, and he's saying, hey, look at all this stuff. Look at all of these fossils. This is not alive today. And he had dinosaur fossils, and he's saying, we don't have something this large. We don't have anything like this alive today. And so he was the first one who ever noticed that. Now, Cuvier was a really cool guy. He dissected everything that is alive today. And he went through and dissected all the birds and dogs and everything. And he really knew anatomically what was related to what. And he knew, looking at fossils, that there was nothing that had a vertebra that big or whatever. So he is saying, well, some catastrophes must have happened to cause organisms to go extinct. There was another guy, his name was Hutton, and he proposed a theory called gradualism. And he is saying that the earth is much, much, much older than what religious scholars have been saying. Up until this point, they thought the earth was like 2,000 or 3,000 years old. But Hutton was looking at geographic and geological formations and saying, it would take so long to form these mountains, and for volcanoes to form, and for South America and Africa to separate. And he said that, the Earth is probably very, very old, and that all of these things are very gradual in their formation, and it's a slow, continuous process. Well, Charles Lyell was another scientist, and what he proposed is that the processes that formed all the geologic features we have today, the mountains, the oceans, rivers, and erosion, and all of that, are caused from the same processes that formed them millions of years ago. And that those processes don't change. Okay, so he's saying that, the Earth probably is much, much older than people really thought it was. That, erosion erodes, but at a fairly continuous rate. And it doesn't all of a sudden erode catastrophically, really fast. Okay. Another scientist came along, and he's again looking at fossils and trying to make sense. And Lamarck proposed his idea for evolution, for how organisms change. And he looked at things like in a giraffe. In the fossil record for a giraffe, they had very short necks. And they have very long necks today. And so he proposed the idea that if an organism needs some characteristic, some trait, it's going to grow it and then pass it on to its offspring. The issue really with him is more of a timing issue. He's saying it's going to happen in one generation, where in actuality, traits like that take thousands and thousands and thousands of generations. You're not just going to grow a neck overnight. Okay? By the way, giraffes have 7 vertebrae in their neck, the same number of vertebrae that you have in your neck, but a hummingbird has 12. I think that's just a cool little fact. Okay. Lamarck also proposed that if you don't use something, you lose it. And he used the idea of the human appendix, that since we don't use it like other organisms use their appendix, that we are in the process of losing it, which is a correct idea, but again, he's saying it's going to happen overnight, where in actuality it happens over thousands and thousands of generations. So Darwin went on his tour, went on the boat, the HMS Beagle, and he sailed from 1831 to 1836. And he collected plants and animals along the way and made all kinds of interesting observations. For example, one of the things that happened, he was collecting fossils, or collecting specimens offshore of Chile. And during the daytime he'd been collecting stuff, and he went back on the boat during the night. And then during the night they'd had a very large earthquake. And he came back ashore the next morning, and he saw the changes that had occurred to the beach, where areas of rock literally had risen 4 or 8 feet or something straight up in the air. And then he looks behind, up at the Andes Mountains, and he looks at the beach again, and he realizes that if earthquakes make the earth rise, how many earthquakes would it have taken to actually build the Andes mountain range? And he knew that the earth was much, much older than people really thought it was. Another time he was, I think in Argentina, he was collecting fossils and collecting specimens, and they were talking with native people, and he asked them to bring him things to collect. And again, he collected fossils and he collected plants and animals and stuff like that. And one of the people brought him a very large fossil of an ancient armadillo that is no longer alive today. It's probably the fossil was probably 4 feet tall and kind of ball-shaped, um, very ancient form of an armadillo. And he knew it, just looking at it, he knew it looked like an armadillo, but there were no armadillos alive today like that. And he just looked at that and he collected it, and it just kind of impacted in his memory and his ideas that, there are things, that animals that have gone extinct. And he didn't realize that before, although these other people had written on it. He really didn't realize that. And so that kind of had an impact on him. Another time, when he was sailing around the Galapagos Islands, the governor of the Galapagos Islands decided to throw a party in honor of the voyage and of Darwin, to kind of, he's trying to show off. Well, they were served like a 12-course dinner that night, which is a lot of food. It takes hours and hours. But the first course was turtle soup, and it was served in the tortoise shell. And the governor was bragging that as they carried the tortoise shell out and was serving people from it, that he could even tell which of the islands that tortoise had been caught from because of the shape of the shell. And Darwin didn't really think about that until he was actually on the voyage home. But he realized on the voyage home that every tortoise on every island had a different shaped shell. And why would that have happened? What was unique about the islands, or what caused the tortoises to have these different shaped shells? And he thought about it and thought about it, and, it kind of put a bee in his bonnet or whatever. It kind of really made him think about what was going on. Well, when he got home, he turned over all of his specimens to various scientists to look at. And the person who is doing the ornithology, which means birds, came to Darwin and said, "You collected all these birds in the Galapagos, but they're all finches." And he's like, "No, they aren't. Look, that's a honeysucker, and that's a seed eater, and that's a blah, blah, blah." And the ornithologist said, "No, they're all finches." And that didn't make, Darwin was kind of flabbergasted. He really didn't know what to make of that. Well, he thought and thought, and his ideas kind of coalesced, and he decided to write an essay, and it's called On the Origin of Species. And he wrote it in 1844, but he didn't publish it until 1858. And the reason was, it was very, very controversial. It went against what the church says. It went against what everybody believed. And he really didn't know if he wanted to tell people what he believed. And so he wrote this, and he just kind of let it set, and he didn't do anything with it, But when he was at groups, and he would go to scientific meetings and things like that, he would kind of say certain things. And people kind of got the idea that he had some interesting ideas. Well, in 1858, he received a letter from another scientist called Alfred Wallace, asking him about his opinion on an essay that he was writing. So Darwin read the essay, realizing it was exactly what he had written in 1844. And so very quickly, Darwin published his. And then he wrote back to Wallace and said, "Great idea. Too bad I already had that idea." So Darwin gets credit for it, although in my mind he was a little bit of a chicken, because he didn't publish what he really thought when he thought about it first. But, that's kind of the history behind this long essay. So what did this essay, by the way, it's like 100 pages long, what did this essay actually say? So some of the ideas that he thought of in there, one was the blue things here tell you. Organisms produce way more offspring than can ever possibly survive. While on his voyages, he realized, and he was, standing on deck looking out over the oceans, he realized that clams and marine invertebrates, when they reproduce hundreds of thousands, if not millions of offspring at a time. And if every single one of those produced millions of offspring, pretty soon the oceans would be filled with clams, and there wouldn't be any more water left. And he knew that's not what's happening. And so he thought about it and kind of came to the conclusion that these organisms are actually providing a food source. These babies are a food source for other organisms. It's kind of like the food chain. You've got these clams producing babies. By the way, the babies are called zooplankton because they're little tiny single-celled swimming animals. And they swim around in the top couple inches of the ocean water, and they provide food for things like coral and really small fish, and even whales will eat plankton, zooplankton being part of it. And so these organisms are eating them, and then those are eaten by other organisms and eaten by other organisms, and so it's kind of like the beginning of the food chain. Well, to be able to survive, a species has to at least, at the very minimum, reproduce the same number as the parents. So if two parents reproduce 3 million babies, which clams do, 2 of them have to survive to be parents. The other 299,000 and so on and so forth are going to die, are going to be eaten. So that's kind of what he's talking about. They produce way more offspring than ever could possibly survive. Okay? The other thing he thought about was something called descent with modification. That means that when organisms reproduce, their offspring are not clones of the parent. They are a combination with differences, with modifications, he used the term. Now, keeping in mind, Darwin does not know anything about DNA or mutation or anything like that, but he did know that when you reproduce, the offspring are not identical. His grandfather was a scientist and had written several articles kind of about this. And what he noticed is that farmers breed. If you have 2 dogs and you want to have a dog that is really good at hunting because it has a really good nose, you're going to reproduce it with another dog with a really good nose, and the offspring are also going to have even better noses. And how in society, farmers and even aristocracy will breed their pets, their animals, and even plants to get the highest yield, to get the characteristics that they want. Those are mutations. Those are differences. Those are modifications. And that's what Darwin thought about. He also made the observation that out of those many offspring that are produced, many of them will die. And the ones that survive are going to be best suited to the environment. They have some characteristic that gives them a slight advantage over the others. Whether it's they could run faster, they could see predators, they could hide, whatever it was, they survived to pass on their genes to their offspring. It's called survival of the fittest. So that was another of Darwin's ideas. So let's put it more into terms like today. Natural selection causes a differential success in reproduction. That means basically survival of the fittest. Organisms that are more fit produce more offspring that survive better than organisms that are less fit. Okay? Natural selection also occurs through an interaction between the environment and the variability inherent among the individual organisms making up the population. So, survival of the fittest. Some organisms have characteristics that make them more fit and are able to survive. One of the products of natural selection is the adaptations of organisms to their environment. The organisms best fit for the environment produce the most offspring. So, in the Galapagos, all of those Galapagos finches that Darwin collected, and here are pictures of all of them, and you can see the differences in the beak sizes and the differences in the beak shape, head shape, coloration, and even what they eat. They all arose from one type of finch. Well, that finch probably ended up on the island because of a hurricane or something that ended up there. They reproduced, and whatever mutations arose in their offspring, because there weren't any other birds on the island, they could find some type of food source and some type of niche. So if you look at this, some of them might have had slight differences in their beak size. Some were eating little seeds, some were eating big seeds. Some were eating cactus because that's what was on that particular island. Some were eating insects, okay, and different sizes of insects. Some were fruit eaters. So whatever type of mutation that they had, many of them were able to find food and adapt. And so from that one species, we now have 3, 6, 10 different species of finches. So what is natural selection? Natural selection is how the environment favors various individuals over others. Okay? Sometimes the environment becomes very hostile. Let's say you have, in the Galapagos, you have some years where there's a lot of rainfall, and so the seeds are very plump and rich and actually hard to crack for birds with small beaks. And so birds with small beaks are not able to get food to crack the seeds, and so they might have fewer babies or might even die themselves. But on some years, when they have a La Nina year, they have much less rainfall than normal, so the seeds are very small and hard to crack and slippery. And so birds with a big beak might not be able to manage to get the seed where they need to in their bill to crack it, but ones with little tiny beaks can. Okay? Let's look at another example. I want to look at bacteria and viruses. Okay, let's say you have a bacterial infection in your body, or a viral infection in your body, but let's do bacteria. You have one bacteria that starts, and then it clones itself, and all the bacteria are identical clones of that original bacteria. You have millions and millions of them in your body. Well, you take an antibiotic. The antibiotic creates a hostile environment that makes it so the bacteria die. If by chance, though, one of those bacteria had a genetic mutation which made it a little bit more tolerant of that particular antibiotic, not necessarily immune to it, but a little more tolerant of it, if you don't take your antibiotics for the full length of time, let's say you only take them for 3 or 4 days, you feel better, you stop taking it, that one is actually going to survive. Well, when it survives, it starts to breed and produce lots of bacteria just like itself who are also tolerant of the antibiotic. And then you get sick a second time, but with a much worse bacteria, because now the antibiotics are not going to work on it. Okay, that's a form of natural selection. Here's another example of a natural selection. Okay, you have some farmers who are crop dusting. They're going to spray their field to kill the bugs. Well, if you look at the bugs, they all have different genes. This one has a particular gene on it, which makes it resistant to the insecticide. Well, the other bugs all died, but that one survived. Because that one survived, when it reproduces, and it's going to reproduce several times, all of the babies have that particular gene that makes them insecticide resistant. Artificial selection is when that type of thing happens, but humans decide which organisms get to survive and which ones don't. So for example, this is a wild type of a mustard, a wild mustard thing. From this plant, humans have altered the plant, selected which seeds to grow, developing all of these different types of vegetables. All of these are descendants of a wild mustard. So you've got broccoli, cauliflower, kale, cabbage, Brussels sprouts. They're all little tiny descendants of mustard. We also decide, for example, which dogs to breed. For thousands of years, we've looked at dogs and bred dogs to be very small, like Chihuahuas, or very big, like Great Danes. We've bred them to have excellent noses and can really track. We have bred them to have different types of fur. we didn't genetically go in and select which genes. We selected which traits by deciding, well, I have a really good dog that has a good nose, and you've got a really good dog that has this characteristic. Let's breed them together and see what kind of puppies we get. We've done that for thousands and thousands of years. That's artificial selection. Okay, some of the evidence that we currently have for evolution comes from lots of different disciplines, more so than any other discovery mankind has ever made. There's more evidence for evolution, flat out. Okay, for example, let's just read through these real quick. In 1908, Morgan discovered the role of chromosomes. Gregor Mendel discovered the inheritance of genetics. Watson and Crick discovered the structure of DNA. In the 1960s, discoveries were made about allele frequencies and how those change over time. Looking at several different types of evidence from DNA analysis, PCR, electrophoresis, geology, paleontology, anatomy, physiology, and the list goes on and on and on. All of these different disciplines have evidence that shows evolution has occurred and is still occurring. So we're going to look at just a few brief things. These are common lines of evidence. One is called homologous structures. This is from anatomy. Homologous structures are parts of the body which are the same parts in different organisms but have completely different functions. So if you look at this picture, a human arm is used for carrying. A cat arm, and these yellow parts are all the same bone structures. That's used for walking. In a whale, it's used for swimming. It's a flipper. In a bat, it's used for flying. But they're all the same bones, but with completely different functions. Well, how did those arise? They arose because we had a common ancestor that also had those bones. Vestigial structures are the historical remnants of structures that were once important in your ancestor, but have very little importance to you. So, for example, in a whale, whales have pelvis bones and a femur bone, but they don't even have a leg. But they still have pelvis and femurs. They don't stick out from the body. They are not attached to anything, but they're remnants of when whales used to be land creatures, and they went back into the water. Boa constrictors actually also have legs. Okay, they have leg bones, and they even have a claw. Males have a claw that sticks out. I think females do too. That sticks out. The claw just barely sticks out from the skin. It's there, but it doesn't seem to have any apparent function. At least not the function that their ancestors had, which was for walking. Snakes used to be lizards. They aren't anymore. Those are vestigial structures. Embryological homologies are homologies, which are similarities that embryos have as they go through their developmental stages. Okay, for example, in humans, very early on, when you were just a little tiny embryo, you used to have pharyngeal slits in your neck. Well, in fish, pharyngeal slits become the gills. Well, you don't have gills. In you, those pharyngeal slits that you develop then close over and it becomes your trachea. The bones in your trachea, not bones, but the cartilage in your trachea. Those are the pharyngeal slits. You used to have a tail. You used to have webbed fingers and toes. All of those are embryological homologies, and you've reabsorbed those. So if you look at the pictures, these are real embryos, very, very early on, and you can see what they are up here. But here on you, here are your pharyngeal slits. This, by the way, would have been the head, and here is the tail. And the tail does stick quite far beyond the leg, which is right here. It's just starting to form. This is going to be the placenta. All of these organisms had pharyngeal slits. You can't hardly see it in that one, but it's right in here. Okay, and even fish have the pharyngeal slits. It's hard to see in this particular picture. Okay, but those are embryological homologies. Another line of evidence are molecular homologies, similarities in your molecules. For example, all DNA, no matter if you are a fungus, a pine tree, or a chicken, all DNA is based on the same 20 nucleotides, or excuse me, the same 4 nucleotides, adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. You have the same structure. The difference is the order of the nucleotides. All proteins in your body are based on the same 20 amino acids. Those are molecular homologies, similarities. Why is all of our DNA based on the same molecules? Because we all arose from bacteria based on the same molecules. Okay, that's molecular. Whoops. So here's an example looking at similarities in hemoglobin, looking at yours. Okay, a rhesus monkey has, out of the 146 amino acids that build hemoglobin, they have 8 of them that are different. A mouse has 27 differences. The further away from a human you get, the more differences. 45. If you look at a sea lamprey, 125. Their hemoglobin is very different from your hemoglobin. Biogeography is another line of evidence. Biogeography talks about the distribution of species worldwide. Darwin noted that similar animals lived in the same area that were more alike than animals that lived in different areas. Okay, that's a form of biogeography. Another line is convergent evolution, where very different species can end up having similar characteristics because they live in similar niches and very, very different environments. So, for example, a sugar glider in Australia is a marsupial, very different from a placental mammal. They have very immature young and stuff like that, kind of related to a kangaroo type of a thing. But it has very similar characteristics as a flying squirrel in North America, which is a rodent, a placental mammal. This is a form of convergent evolution. The fossil record also gives lines of evidence for evolution. There are many different links between species that you can find in the fossil record. For example, back around 2000, 2002, someplace in that range, a fossil called Tiktaalik was discovered in Alaska that is a direct link between salamanders and fish. And this Tiktaalik fossil has characteristics of fish. It has scales on its body, it has gills, those types of characteristics, but it also has the flattened head of a salamander, and it has arms with fingers like a salamander. So it's a direct link. That's a fossil record evidence. Not all animals are preserved as fossils, but a lot of them are, and you can find really cool evidence. Here's another line of evidence. This is an ancient whale. Well, this whale had hip bones, had a pelvis, had a femur, and the tibia and the fibula, the patella, and the foot inside a flipper. And if you look at the fossils of various whales, that hip bone and leg bones become smaller and smaller and smaller until you end up with the picture that I showed you of a modern whale, where there's very little left, very little vestigial left from that. Reason I'm showing you this is Harriet. This is a tortoise that Darwin brought back from England, brought back from his travels in the Galapagos, back to England. How he ended up, she ended up at the Australia Zoo, I don't know, but she was the last remnant of Darwin's voyages. She died in 2006 at the age of 176 years old. So that's Harriet. One of the issues I would like you to read about is crop biodiversity issues. You need to go to this website. You have to read the article. And then I want you to answer these 3 questions. What is meant by the term biodiversity? Why is biodiversity important in crops? And develop 3 questions that arose in your mind as you were reading the article. Okay, those 3 things. So, take a minute, write down this website, go there, and that is your homework for tonight. Have a wonderful night. Bye.